Ye, or better known as Kanye West, is one of the most influential musicians in the history of recorded sound. That is not a hyperbole, that is not an exaggeration, and it is just a fact. The College Dropout, which he released in 2004, redefined what hip-hop could say absolutely and how it could say those things. Late Registration, Graduation, 808s and Heartbreak, and each one of these albums was a recalibration of what the form of music known as hip-hop was capable of. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy was released in 2010 and is still regarded by serious, genuine critics as one of the greatest albums ever made by anyone in any genre. He produced for Jay-Z, he produced for Beyonce, he produced for Alicia Keys, all such monumental figures, and he changed the sonic landscape of an entire decade before most people even knew his name. The self-belief that produced all of that was not incidental to the work, however. It was the very source of it. And then, however, somewhere in the distance between then and what came after, the hospitalization, the erratic public behavior, and the anti-Semitism, and the increasingly incoherent interviews, all characterized as the slow, visible, undeniable unraveling of one of the most gifted people of his entire generation, the belief stopped becoming a tool or stopped being used as a tool and instead became the whole person. That is the exact moment Friedrich Nietzsche was warning us about over 100 years ago. Friedrich Nietzsche died in the 1900s. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a complete mental disarray, in mental collapse. He was unable to write. He was even unable to speak coherently, and in turn, he was tended to by his sister in a house in Weimar. And he never saw the 20th century even arrive in his life. He never saw the internet. He never saw the attention economy or the specific conditions of a modern fame that takes a person's self-concept and amplifies it to a scale that no human psychology could ever withstand or was ever even built to understand. And yet somehow his work describes what happened to Kanye West with such precision and such accuracy that it should feel uncomfortable that he was able to write that so in advance. How does a man writing in the 1800s in boarding houses across all of Europe predict with such exact precision, with surgical precision, the collapse of a figure that he could never have imagined to exist? It's simple. It's because he was writing about the self instead of writing about fame. He was writing about what happens to a person when the internal structure that was supposed to accompany their extraordinary self-belief never actually gets built upon it. It was about the specific and the devastating gap between the will to power and the discipline it was always requiring. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch, which was the overman or the self-created individual to define it, is one of the most misread ideas in the history of philosophy. It is almost always taken and used as some sort of permission slip, as justification for the person who already believes that they are exceptional to stop subjecting themselves to the friction of other people's reality. That is not what Nietzsche intended, nor what he meant to write about. The Übermensch was not a person who had escaped any sort of accountability, but instead it was a person who had developed that internal discipline to create and maintain their own values. Not as a license for unchecked behavior, but instead as the result of rigorous self-examination. The self-overcoming over others, that is what Nietzsche wrote about. It was the power over the self. It was the capacity to continue becoming and to continue refining oneself and to never allow the current version of yourself to calcify into something permanent and defended. What happens when you take away the permission without the discipline is not the Übermensch. Instead, it is something much more ordinary. It's something much more visible nowadays. It is simply a person who has mistaken the absence of their external limits for the presence of their internal ones. Kanye, however, took that permission slip. The absolute conviction that the vision had in his mind or in his head was so correct that it was undeniable. The refusal to accept other people's limits as his own. The certainty that what he was making was exactly what it needed to be. And for a very, very long time in his career, that certainty was vindicated by the work. The work was literally as good, if not better, than he believed it would be. And the self-belief and the output were proportional, and due to that, it kept growing the self-belief with the output maybe not growing alongside it. Now, the sincere problem with that is that the conviction never developed the counterweight that Nietzsche considered essential for one to have: the self-examination, the capacity to understand that some people are wrong. Sometimes I myself am wrong. The distinction between the vision being right and the person being infallible. Over time, those two things, the work and the self, they became indistinguishable for him. To criticize the work was to attack the person. It was literally parallel. To question the person, question anything they were doing, was to fail to understand their work. And a self that cannot be questioned cannot be corrected. A self that cannot be corrected cannot grow, and it can only defend. Now, here is where the passage or this video stops being about Kanye West and actually starts defining you as a person. Because the version of this that lives in most people is not genius and public collapse, but instead is a smaller and a much quieter and considerably harder version to see from the inside. It is the exact self-belief that has gradually stopped being a tool for building their life and a tool for building their or creating anything, and instead has started to become a reason not to examine anything. The conviction that has curdled from confidence into defensiveness. The identity that was so thoroughly constructed around being right, around being the best possible creator of anything that you pursue. It was about the work, it was about the distraction, it was about the vision, that the cost of being wrong has become too high to pay. That conviction is the very thing that Nietzsche warned us about that long ago. And you probably know what those things cost of you. It is that self-belief that has gradually stopped being a tool for building something and instead started being a reason not to examine anything that you build now. The conviction which curdled from the confidence into defensiveness. And it is the exact identity that is so thoroughly constructed around being right, around being the best producer of anything that you create, and about the work or about the direction and about the vision, that the cost of being wrong itself has become too high for you to pay as a person. You yourself probably do know what that costs of you. Not hugely, not dramatically, but simply in the small and simple ways of life. The feedback which you may have dismissed far too quickly. The relationships that you could not think would survive your certainty. The version of the work that did not ever get produced or made simply because thinking or making it would have required admitting that the current version you now have isn't enough. Nietzsche's warning was not that self-belief destroys people as a whole, but instead that self-belief without self-examination destroys people. That the will to power turned outward without the internal discipline that was always supposed to accompany it, that was always supposed to go side by side, parallel. That is what produces not the Übermensch, but instead its shadow. It is a person so defended that they have become unreachable and are unable to create anything new or better. The thing to carry from this whole video, the thing to carry from Nietzsche, from Kanye, from everything I've said this video, is that this is not humility in the cheap sense. It is not the performance of uncertainty. It is not that studied, unbothered quality that it is its own kind of deadness that hides in its own reality. Instead, it's the harder thing to accept. It's the harder thing to understand. It is the very willingness to allow the work to be questioned because the work and the self are not the same thing. That is the very thing that you have to comprehend. Kanye lost that distinction. That is what he did not understand. And he lost that somewhere between his genius and the noise of being such a genius. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it coming over 140 years before it ever actually happened. And due to this, the question is not whether you actually admire either one of them, whether you admire Kanye or Friedrich Nietzsche or any other philosopher or musician or anything of the sort. The question is, which one of those have you been living as?